Hey guys, tonight we walk barefoot into the oldest mud brick twilight we can reasonably imagine, where river water glints black under the moon, reed boats tap softly at the shore, and somewhere beyond the fields a temple platform rises like a patient staircase into the dark. You are here for a story about 13 Sumerian bloodlines chosen to survive every Anunnaki catastrophe on Earth. And right away we should keep our footing steady. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination? Most historians agree that southern Mesopotamia really did give rise to some of the world's earliest cities, while historians debate how much later myth can tell us about real families, real disasters, or real memory. So yes, you probably won't survive this in the sense that your modern knees, your hydration schedule, and your suspicious dependence on air conditioning are all going to complain before midnight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me your location and local time when you're listening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in mud. That sounds rude, but it is also accurate. The evidence we do have points to southern Mesopotamia as a place where life is built from silt reeds, baked clay, and stubborn human routine. Most historians agree that early Sumerian civilization grows between the Tigris and Euphrates in a landscape that is generous and annoying in equal measure. It feeds you, then floods your storage room. It gives you irrigation, then salts your field like it is personally offended by your wheat plans. Archaeology suggests that cities such as Uruk do not appear because somebody wakes up one morning with a grand empire blueprint, but because generations of people keep organising canals, labour storehouses, temples and trade until villages thicken into something far more crowded and complicated. So you stand at the edge of one of those early cities, breathing in warm mud, damp reeds, wood smoke, and the faint animal funk that every ancient settlement seems to have considered an acceptable civic fragrance. A dog noses through trash. Somewhere a pot cracks in a kiln. Somewhere else a priest clears his throat with the solemn dignity of a man who would like you to know he speaks for heaven, or at least has a respectable working relationship with it. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian life is deeply tied to city-states' temple economies and ruling households. The solid ground is this: people organise themselves around institutions, and those institutions remember families. Names matter, descent matters, inheritance matters, office matters. If your father tends temple fields, keeps accounts, oversees labour, or serves a ruler that does not guarantee your future, but it certainly does not hurt. One interpretation is that later legends about chosen bloodlines may preserve a distorted memory of elite continuity, not in a supernatural sense first, but in a social one. Certain families really do survive what ruins others, not because a glowing god descends with a golden clipboard, but because power-grained scribal skill and good marriages have a funny way of floating when times get rough. And yet the mind drifts, because once you have cities, kings, priests and disasters, you also have stories. And once you have stories, you have that very human habit of looking backward through smoke and deciding that somebody must have known something. A popular rumour claims that behind the oldest Sumerian traditions lurks a secret pattern, a set of bloodlines chosen by the Anunnaki to endure every collapse. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it tells you something interesting anyway. It tells you modern people are still hypnotised by the old names. We look at lists of kings, divine genealogies and flood tales, and we want the whole thing to click like a puzzle box. We want 13 houses, 13 seals, 13 lines preserved like embers under ash. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the story becomes more interesting, not less. Because now you are not trying to prove that invisible beings managed ancient genetics like a celestial bookkeeping department. You are following clues through a world where catastrophe is normal. Rivers shift, crops fail, rival cities raid one another, temples rise and fall, dynasties brag, scribes copy old names because old names carry weight. Somewhere in that long relay of memory, the idea takes shape that some lines endure because they were meant to. Historians still argue whether ancient Mesopotamian kingship language should be read mostly as ritual symbolism, political theatre, or a genuine expression of how people understood divine order. That debate matters here. When a ruler says the gods favoured his house, he might be making a theological statement, a political claim, or the Bronze Age equivalent of posting a very confident resume online. Probably all three. The point is that survival is never just survival. It must be explained. It must be narrated. Somebody has to say why this family still rules while another one disappears into the dust. Tonight, before we ever get to 13, you sit with the older question. Why do some names remain? The documented answer is not glamorous, though it has its own dry charm. Records endure where institutions endure. Temples keep tablets. Palaces keep officials. Wealth keeps genealogies. If your family is poor, displaced, enslaved, or simply unlucky, history may shrug and move on. If your family is attached to ritual administration or kingship, your name may survive for centuries in clay. Not because fate loves you more, but because archives do. And archives, bless them, are basically ancient junk drawers with better handwriting, still under the neat rows of cuneiform imagination hums. You can picture a night after floodwater has receded, when the city smells of rot and wet straw, when surviving elders gather under oil lamps and call names aloud. Not every household answers. Some doorways stay dark. A careful reading might suggest that later tales of chosen survival grow from scenes like this, where memory narrows and the living cling to whatever order they can salvage. They sort the loss into lineages, duties, inheritances. Who still has seed grain? Who still knows the canal routes? Who can recite the rites? Who can write? Who can marry whom? Who still belongs to the thread that has not snapped? And if you lean just a little further into the mist, you can imagine priests giving that thread a larger meaning. Not merely fortunate, chosen, not merely organised, preserved, not merely powerful, watched. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not aliens landing behind a ziggurat with dramatic soundtrack music. Ancient life is already dramatic enough, thank you very much. A more cautious explanation could be that people facing repeated disaster naturally frame survival as selection. When the world keeps breaking endurance, feels sacred, the family that keeps returning begins to look marked by heaven or destiny or the favour of gods whose motives are never entirely explained. Over generations, that feeling hardens into tradition. Tradition hardens into story. Story hardens into myth. And myth, as always, wears its oldest mask and says, I was here the whole time. So you keep walking through the warm dark of Sumer, past reed fences and low walls with the temple silhouette ahead and canal water whispering beside you. The first catastrophe has not yet arrived in full, at least not in the way later tellers will describe it. But the mood is already there. The city knows that prosperity is temporary. Everyone here lives close to fragility. Everyone here understands in their bones what your grocery store and your weather app politely try to hide from you. Civilization is a very impressive arrangement of hopes stacked on top of mud. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But for now, as lamp smoke drifts and the oldest names begin to gather, you can feel how the idea of chosen bloodlines might first begin. Not in certainty, not in proof. In memory, fear, prestige, and the deeply human wish to believe. that when the next great ruin comes, somebody has already been selected to carry the fire through it. By morning, the mud has dried into a pale crust on your sandals. The canal water has turned from black glass to brown shimmer, and the city around you begins its daily performance of controlled chaos. Donkeys complain like underpaid supervisors. A child runs past with a loaf tucked under one arm. Somewhere a brewer is already at work, which honestly feels like one of the more respectable career choices in any century. You move deeper into the river cities now, into the living fabric of Uruk-ur-Kish, and the lesser places that cling to the floodplain like determined little thoughts. And what's broadly accepted is that these communities are not isolated marvels. They are linked by trade, by rivalry, by shared religious habits, by irrigation systems, and by family ties that stretch farther than any single courtyard wall. Most historians agree that Sumerian city-states developed through dense social networks rather than pure splendid isolation. Archaeology suggests that goods, ideas, labour practices, and religious symbols circulate across southern Mesopotamia over long periods. Pottery styles echo from place to place. Administrative habits spread. Temple forms resemble one another. Even when cities fight, they also imitate. That is one of humanity's most dependable talents. We can dislike our neighbours and still copy their best accounting methods. You can almost hear the grumbling, "Yes, Kish is insufferable," but their grain tallies are annoyingly efficient. The evidence we do have points to a world in which kinship matters as much as brick. Households are economic units, ritual units, and political units all at once. Family names, where they can be traced, are tied to office, property, patronage, and memory. One interpretation is that ancestry becomes one of the main tools by which power is made legible. If a ruler wants legitimacy, he does not present himself as a random fellow who wandered in with strong opinions and a nice beard. He ties himself to a line. He belongs somewhere. He descends from someone. The city must be able to imagine continuity through him. That matters because once continuity becomes sacred, survival begins to look hereditary. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Historians still argue whether ancient claims of lineage reflect stable biological descent, adopted political symbolism, or some untidy blend of both. In the ancient world, family can be literal, ceremonial, or strategically invented, depending on what the moment requires. A careful reading might suggest that later bloodline legends grow out of this flexibility. If elite households keep presenting themselves as the thread connecting one crisis to the next, then later listeners may imagine those threads as something older, stranger, even selected. You walk through a district where low houses press together in baked earth shades of tan, rust and faded gold. Reed mats hang in doorways. The smell is part bread, part dung, fuel, part damp wool, with a side note of riverbank funk that absolutely nobody here has time to apologise for. Women grind grain in shaded courtyards. Men haul baskets of clay or barley. Scribes sit with tablets and styluses, shaping wedges into wet surfaces with the patient expression of people inventing bureaucracy one sigh at a time. Most historians agree that this world depends on record-keeping and organised labour. What's broadly accepted is that once resources, duties and offerings are written down, the households connected to those records gain a better chance of being remembered. A memory is half the game, because catastrophe in a river civilization is never far away. It may be flood drought, salinised fields, political collapse, invasion, bad harvests, or the very ordinary fact that one canal fails and takes 3 neighbourhoods with it. The modern imagination loves a single apocalypse with dramatic skies and ominous drums, but a more cautious explanation could be that Mesopotamian people live through repeated smaller disasters that feel just as final when you are standing in them barefoot. If your storehouse is ruined, your ox is dead, and your cousin has vanished into military service, you do not need a movie trailer voice to tell you civilization is having a difficult week. One interpretation is that stories of chosen survival begin not with fantasy, but with observation. Certain families seem to endure. They marry well, they retain temple roles, they move grain, control labour, and preserve ritual knowledge. When a district is damaged, they reappear. When a dynasty falls, some branches of its old officials turn up again under new masters. The names shift, but the pattern of endurance remains. A careful reading might suggest that this is where ancestry becomes more than biography. It becomes a survival technology. A fringe idea proposes that these recurring lineages were recognised by the Anunnaki themselves, marked out across generations as if the gods were managing a long and patient evacuation list. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because it dramatises a real question. Why do some houses remain central through repeated upheaval? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the supernatural language begins to look like a poetic exaggeration of something social and historical. To the people living inside the pattern, a resilient family might truly seem watched. And what if in the lamplight watched is exactly the word they choose? You pass a shrine niche where incense curls upward in slow grey ribbons. A priest murmurs over offerings. A merchant bows just enough to remain respectable without appearing too desperate, which is probably the Bronze Age version of networking. Divine favour is everywhere in the public language of the city. Most historians agree that gods are understood not as distant abstractions, but as active patrons of place order, fertility, kingship and protection. Archaeology suggests that temples stand at the centre of city life, not only spiritually but economically. If the gods are woven into administration, then family prestige can be described in sacred terms without anyone thinking this is unusual. So when later tradition remembers that one house kept land, another kept priesthood, another kept scribal authority, the memory may harden into a sacred map. Not random survival, chosen survival, not simple inheritance, preserved inheritance. The distinction matters emotionally, even if the practical mechanics look very human from up close. Grain in the right room, marriage in the right season, loyalty to the winning faction, a son trained to write, a daughter married into a temple household. Nothing glamorous. And yet history often turns on precisely these boring little miracles. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the bloodlines are less about genetics in the modern sense and more about continuity through institutions. A house remains because it is attached to the temple. A temple remains because it anchors labour and storage. A city remains because enough households can still organise water and grain. The family becomes a vessel for memory, office and adaptation. The evidence we do have points to the stubborn resilience of systems carried by people who know where the ledgers are, where the offerings go, and which cousin must absolutely not be trusted with the goat count. Still, the number of survivors in popular imagination keeps shrinking and sharpening. Not dozens of families, not all the old houses, a handful, a chosen few, 13 perhaps. Once later, storytellers impose a tidy, symbolic frame on a messier reality. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clue here is simple. River cities produce both records and legends, and both are obsessed with continuity. By the time the sun leans westward, and the canals throw back strips of copper light, you can feel how the city teaches its own lesson. Everyone here belongs to layers larger than themselves: household, district, temple, city, god. If catastrophe comes, it will not test isolated individuals first. It will test networks, kinship, ritual, storage, writing, trust. And in that test, some names will disappear, while others pass from clay tablet to clay tablet, from priest to scribe, from memory into myth. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But as evening settles over the river cities, and the family names travel farther than footsteps ever could, it is easy to understand how later generations might picture certain lineages being quietly counted whenever the sky turns strange. The evening cools a little, which, in southern Mesopotamia, means the air stops actively arguing with your skin and settles into a more passive form of discomfort. Oil lamps wake one by one. The canal gives off that soft, wet smell of reeds and mud and fish that no luxury candle company has ever dared to bottle, though perhaps they should. You move now toward the places where memory is trained, where power learns to read itself, and what's broadly accepted is that literacy, ritual knowledge, and administrative skill are concentrated in the hands of a relatively small, educated class. If the city survives by grain and water, it also survives by tablets, recitations, and people who know which god gets which hymn on which holy day. Most historians agree that scribal culture matters enormously in Mesopotamia. Archaeology suggests that clay tablets preserve not only myths and royal boasts, but contracts, receipts, lists, school exercises, offerings, field measurements, and the kind of practical notes that reveal civilization is held together by paperwork just as much as by prayer. The evidence we do have points to trained scribes as guardians of continuity. They count what comes in. They note what goes out. They copy older texts. They preserve formulas, titles and names. In a world where flood can erase a field boundary and war can burn a district, the person who can recreate the record is not just useful. The person who can recreate the record is a small miracle in a linen wrap. And beside the scribes stand the ritual specialists. Priests, temple officials, chanters, diviners, and attendants do not all share the same function, of course, but together they help shape the city's conversation with the divine. Most historians agree that temples are economic centres, as well as sacred ones. They store goods, employ labourers, manage land, and stage ceremonies that reinforce order. One interpretation is that elite scribal and priestly houses become so central to continuity that later listeners imagine them as bloodlines specially preserved through catastrophe. That is not the same as saying the Anunnaki literally hand-picked them from a glowing balcony in the sky. It is a more cautious explanation and therefore much less cinematic, which is honestly rude of history, but fairly typical. Still, the cinematic version has staying power, because imagine it with me for a moment, gently and without pretending we are proving anything. A storm has passed, reed roofs sag, courtyards are slick with mud, granaries are checked by lamplight, families huddle in exhausted silence, while somewhere above them temple singers resume the proper hymns, as if sound itself can reassemble the world. Who helps the city feel real again? The people who know the rites. The people who know the calendar. The people who know how to read old marks in new disaster. A careful reading might suggest that this is why scribal and priestly houses attract an aura of chosen endurance. They do not merely survive events, they narrate survival back into existence. Historians still argue whether literacy in early Mesopotamia should be seen mainly as an administrative technology or as part of a broader sacred authority. The answer is probably some blend of both, depending on time and place. What's broadly accepted is that writing begins with practical needs and then stretches outward into literature, kingship, ritual, memory, and prestige. Once that happens, families attached to writing gain a peculiar kind of power. They can speak to the dead. They can preserve the names of rulers long after their walls collapse. They can copy a prayer from centuries earlier and make the past sound present again. You can see why that would feel suspiciously close to immortality. You enter a tablet house where apprentices kneel in rows, shaping wedges into damp clay, with the tense concentration of children who know that one wrong sign may earn them a correction from a teacher who has completely run out of patience with artistic interpretations of accounting. Little practice texts dry on shelves. Some repeat lexical lists, some copy proverbs, some mangle spellings in ways that would comfort every parent of a modern schoolchild. Most historians agree that scribal education is rigorous, repetitive, and elite. Not everyone gets to do this. Literacy is a gate, and gates are what powerful families adore most. One interpretation is that later stories of protected bloodlines may owe something to this exclusivity. A house that trains scribes preserves not only wealth, but access to the machine that converts life into durable memory. If catastrophe wipes out crops, you still need seed. If it wipes out archives, you need trained minds. The family that can restore contracts, rituals, boundaries, tax obligations, and sacred language looks less like a household and more like an ark. Not a floating wooden one perhaps, but an ark of competence which is less dramatic and somehow more impressive. A fringe idea proposes that priestly and scribal families were chosen because they preserve forbidden knowledge passed down from the Anunnaki, hidden in symbols ordinary people could not understand. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin, so we should say so plainly. Mesopotamian writing evolves through human use, adaptation, and institutional need. There is no solid mainstream evidence for supernatural dictation of elite lineages. But if we treat the theory as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it reveals a useful emotional truth. Knowledge often feels otherworldly to those excluded from it. The person who can read signs, interpret omens, and summon the past from clay may look like a magician even when he is just a very overworked administrator with cramped fingers. And then there are the rituals. Incense thickens the air inside a temple room. Copper glints. White garments catch the lamplight. A chant moves up and down like slow breath. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion is woven through daily and political life. The gods are not weekend hobbies. They are involved in kingship, harvest, justice, war plague, and prosperity. The evidence we do have points to ritual expertise as a serious form of authority. One interpretation is that households tied to these rites come to seem indispensable during crisis because they maintain the relationship between city and cosmos when everything else wobbles. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the chosen bloodline is not the strongest warrior house or even the richest household, but the one that can remember correctly under pressure. The one that knows which lamentation to sing when walls fall. The one that can interpret an eclipse without causing the neighbourhood to spiral into panic buying barley. The one that can tell a new ruler how the old offerings were done so the heavens, or at least public confidence, do not unravel completely. A more cautious explanation could be that catastrophe selects not for mystical purity but for families who carry portable systems of order in their heads. You watch a senior scribe press a seal into wet clay and lift it away cleanly, leaving a neat image behind. It is such a small action, almost nothing, yet it feels final, official, strangely powerful. This is how continuity often works in the ancient world. Not with thunder, with repetition, with formula, with inheritance, with hands teaching other hands how not to forget. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But as the lamps burn lower and the tablet shelves hold their little universe of names, debts, hymns, and duties, you can understand how later storytellers might imagine certain scribal and priestly houses as passports through catastrophe, the families who carry the city's memory when everything else has gone soft and dark around them. The lamps have burned low. The chants have thinned into the night, and somewhere beyond the temple quarter, a dog begins one of those long philosophical barks that seems to accuse the moon of administrative negligence. You keep walking because the city has not finished talking to you yet. It rarely does. Now the road turns toward kings, or at least towards the stories kings leave behind, and what's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamia preserves royal memory in a way that is half record, half performance. The Sumerian king list, in particular, stands before you like a polished old mirror that reflects something real, something distorted, and something intentionally theatrical all at once. Most historians agree that the Sumerian king list is an important historical source, but not a simple one. Archaeology suggests that some rulers named in it correspond to places and dynasties grounded in the material record, while others belong to a much hazier zone where myth, ideology and memory mingle freely. The evidence we do have points to the list as a political document shaped over time, likely designed to present kingship as a single institution, passed from city to city according to divine order. That is the solid ground. The mist begins when those reign lengths stretch into the impossible, when antediluvian kings rule for astonishing spans, and when the whole thing starts sounding less like a filing system and more like a cosmic flex, which to be fair it partly is. You can imagine the effect on a listener hearing those names recited in a dim hall: Alulim, Alalga, Enmen Luanna, Enmen Galana, Dumuzid, En Sipad Zidana. The names roll out like beads on a thread that seems to vanish backward into floodwater. One interpretation is that the king list preserves real traditions of succession and political memory even while dramatising them for legitimacy. A more cautious explanation could be that later rulers used the past not to document it faithfully, but to inherit its aura. If your dynasty can present itself as the next rightful bearer of kingship after a long sacred chain, then your present troubles suddenly look less embarrassing and more cosmically authorised. Historians still argue whether the earliest portions of the king list preserve faint echoes of actual remembered rulers or function mostly as mythic framing for later political claims. That debate matters here because this is where the idea of chosen survivor bloodlines starts to feel almost unavoidable, even if the exact phrase is modern. The list does not speak in those terms, not directly, but it does create a rhythm of endurance. Disaster comes, order breaks, kingship is re-established, a city falls, another inherits, something passes through ruin and keeps going. You stand near a palace courtyard at dawn, where officials shuffle tablets, and the first sun catches the edge of a doorframe. The place smells of dust oil and old wool with a faint sweetness from crushed dates somewhere nearby. Servants move quickly. Guards try very hard to look carved from stone, though one of them is clearly fighting a yawn of epic proportions. Most historians agree that kingship in Mesopotamia is never only personal, it is institutional, ceremonial, and deeply entangled with divine favour. When a ruler claims that kingship descended from heaven, that may sound dramatic to you, but to them it is part theology, part politics, and part public relations campaign with excellent branding. A careful reading might suggest that the king list becomes a kind of lantern-lit roll call after ruin, not a literal emergency register, not a secret bunker manifest, but a way of saying that despite flood conflict and collapse, the thread has not snapped. Someone remained, someone inherited, someone was counted. And because the list is selective by nature, because it remembers only certain rulers and not the countless ordinary households beneath them, later imaginations can easily widen its royal thread into a larger idea. If kingship survives through designated lines, what else might have survived the same way? Priestly houses, scribal houses, elite marriages, temple administrators, those who stood close enough to power for memory to hold them. A fringe idea proposes that the impossible reign lengths and selective succession patterns preserve hidden signals about special bloodlines protected by the Anunnaki through repeated catastrophes. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The mainstream explanation is simpler and sturdier. Ancient kingship texts often magnify the past, stretch time and tidy chaos into a meaningful sequence. That is what royal ideology does. It takes a noisy, breakable human world and arranges it into a story that sounds ordained. But if we treat the fringe idea as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it does help you feel why the list still fascinates people. It reads like memory trying to survive its own damage. And that may be the real point. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the pre-flood and post-flood divisions in Mesopotamian tradition are not encrypted genetic records, but cultural ways of organising trauma. Flood before, order after, collapse before, restoration after. In that structure, certain names become bridges. They reassure the listener that the world, though damaged, remains legible. A more cautious explanation could be that chosen survivors are simply the figures tradition finds useful for stitching together a broken timeline. The king list does not preserve everyone because no text can. It preserves the line of continuity the culture most wants to believe in. And continuity, once stylized, begins to glow. Picture a scribe copying the old names by lamplight. He is careful, deliberate, slightly annoyed by the quality of the clay, and not at all aware that thousands of years later somebody on the internet will stare at his sequence like it is a treasure map. Yet his work matters. Most historians agree that copying traditions shape what survives. Archaeology suggests that texts endure not because they are neutral, but because institutions preserve what they value. If a lineage appears in a royal narrative, it gains afterlife. If it is omitted, it may vanish into the same silence that swallowed most human lives. So perhaps the king list does not hand you 13 chosen bloodlines outright. That would be too tidy, and ancient evidence is rarely that polite. But it teaches you how old cultures framed endurance. Not everybody remains. Only some names pass through. Only some houses are narrated back into the light. One interpretation is that later bloodline legends emerge from exactly this habit of selective remembrance. The survivors are not just those who lived, they are those who were woven into the official pattern. You feel that pattern everywhere now, in the repeated titles, in the transfer of kingship from city to city, in the sense that power is never simply invented new, but inherited, justified, recalled. The evidence we do have points to a civilization obsessed with legitimacy through continuity. That obsession does not prove supernatural protection. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it raises the possibility that later stories of preserved lineages are not random fantasy. They are poetic overgrowth on a very old trunk. The sky lightens. Workers begin to stir. Somewhere a cook bangs a pot with the righteous irritation of someone who has had to make breakfast for officials again. Civilization wakes in layers, and the king list remains where it has always remained, between ledger and legend, between document and dream. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But as the names continue through flood and after flood, it is easy to hear them not just as rulers, but as survivors called aloud after a night when much of the world has gone quiet. By the time the sun climbs higher, the city begins to sweat. Walls radiate heat. Dust lifts under sandals and hangs in the light like a lazy curse. You keep moving anyway, because the oldest stories in Mesopotamia are never far from water, and water, as ever, is both a blessing and a menace. What's broadly accepted is that flood experience shapes the imagination of southern Mesopotamia in profound ways. Archaeology suggests that rivers shift, canals fail, fields drown, and whole communities learn to live with the rude fact that the landscape can change its mind faster than a king can issue a decree. If you want to understand why survivor lineages later sound plausible, you begin here, with mud on the threshold and watermarks on the wall. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian flood stories grow from real environmental vulnerability even if the great literary versions are not simple eyewitness reports, the evidence we do have points to a low alluvial plain where irrigation is essential and dangerous at once. Too little water and crops wither. Too much and your neatly planned season turns into a floating argument with the cosmos. A more cautious explanation could be that the famous flood traditions compress many local disasters into one giant memory shape. Instead of telling 1,000 separate stories about ruined fields, collapsed levees, drowned animals, and panicked households, culture gathers them into a single overwhelming image. It is easier to carry one vast flood in the mind than 100 smaller ones, even if the smaller ones are what actually happened most often. That matters because disaster stories do not only preserve fear, they preserve sorting. Who escaped? Who did not? Who rebuilt first? Who still had grain? Who still had labourers? Who still had temple access? Who still knew which canal should be cleared before the planting season utterly gave up on humanity? Most historians agree that the practical aftermath of flooding requires organisation, memory, and leadership. One interpretation is that repeated river crises encouraged the idea that selected families were better equipped or perhaps divinely favoured to endure them. Not chosen in a cinematic beam of light sense, but chosen in the very earthly sense that certain houses consistently sat closest to storage, ritual, authority, and decision-making. Historians still argue whether the Mesopotamian flood traditions preserve specific regional events, a broader cultural memory of environmental instability, or mainly literary theology. That debate sits at the centre of tonight's topic, because once you admit the world is unstable, you begin asking who remains stable within it. And once you ask that question long enough, the answer hardens into lineage. You walk now along a canal bank where reeds shiver in hot wind, dragonflies skim the surface, a fisherman checks his net, with the resigned face of a man who knows the river has once again developed opinions. The mud underfoot is layered, packed and old. Somewhere beneath it lie earlier surfaces, earlier walls, earlier courtyards. Archaeology suggests that many Mesopotamian sites are built in stacked phases, city upon city, occupation upon occupation. The solid ground is that communities are rebuilt, again and again. A careful reading might suggest that survivor myths emerge naturally in such places, because every rebuilt wall quietly asks the same question: who was here before and who came back after? A popular rumour claims that the flood stories hide a secret roster of bloodlines preserved by the Anunnaki through every catastrophe, as if divine overseers kept selecting the same houses while cities washed away around them. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin, so let's not dress it in royal robes. The flood traditions that survive in literary texts are shaped by theology, kingship, and storytelling. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it gives us a mood worth following. It imagines catastrophe not as total erasure, but as a test of continuity. Not everything is saved, only enough. And that idea is very old. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the chosen houses are simply those embedded in the machinery of recovery. Temples reopen distribution, scribes restore obligations and land records. Priestly families reassure the population that divine order has not dissolved. Ruling households gather labour and redirect resources. A more cautious explanation could be that later generations look back at these functions and reinterpret them as signs of supernatural preservation. The house that can reassemble order after flood looks almost eerie in its resilience. Everyone else is still scraping mud out of their doorway, and this family already has a plan, a ledger, 3 cousins in strategic marriages and a priest's uncle, reminding everyone that the gods have definitely not abandoned the district. Helpful, if slightly unbearable. You pass a storehouse where workers haul sacks inside under the watchful gaze of a clerk with a tablet, and the emotional range of a rain barrel. Grain is counted, jars are sealed, names are noted. Most historians agree that control of surplus is central to survival in ancient Mesopotamia. If flood ruins one neighbourhood, grain reserves and labour networks determine whether rebuilding happens at all. One interpretation is that bloodline legends later attach themselves to households associated with storage and redistribution, not because sacks of barley are mystical, but because survival often depends on whoever has the keys to the boring room. The literary flood stories add another layer. In later Mesopotamian tradition, a chosen figure survives deluge and carries life forward. Most historians agree that these narratives are mythic and theological rather than straightforward history. Still, they shape how catastrophe is imagined. The pattern is not random death and chaotic recovery. The pattern is warning selection, preservation, renewal. A careful reading might suggest that this narrative structure encourages people to think in terms of chosen continuity. If one hero can be preserved through flood, why not one family, one priestly house, one set of lineages tied to divine purpose? A fringe idea proposes that the number 13 belongs to an ancient hidden flood schema, a coded tally of family lines chosen to persist after repeated Anunnaki catastrophes. This theory isn't widely accepted, and there is no broad mainstream evidence for a literal Sumerian list of 13 protected bloodlines. That's a possibility, not a certainty. More likely, the number is a later symbolic frame placed over older fragments, because humans adore meaningful numbers almost as much as we adore pretending messy history was actually an elegant plan. It is one of our more charming flaws. Still, on an afternoon like this, with sunlight glaring off the canal and the smell of wet clay rising from the bank, you can feel why the idea endures. The city exists by negotiation with forces it cannot control. Water gives life. Water destroys life. Each season is a wager. Each generation inherits both prosperity and risk. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the floods were real enough as recurring danger. We know rebuilding was real. We know institutions and elite households carried continuity. What we cannot confirm is whether later whispers of chosen bloodlines preserve an ancient secret or merely the emotional outline of survival observed too many times. By evening, shadows stretch long over the reeds, and the city breathes a little easier. Children shout near the water. A priest passes with a bowl of offerings. Somewhere a reed flute tests a soft, uncertain melody, as if the day itself is trying to remember how to relax. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But the mud beneath your sandals remembers repeated endings, and in that memory, it is easy to understand how stories of selected survivors begin to gather power family by family, flood by flood, until the river itself seems to whisper that only certain names will answer when the roll is called. By nightfall, the heat has finally loosened its grip, and the temple district begins to feel less like an oven and more like a place where human thoughts can occur without steaming. Oil lamps flicker in alcoves. The mud brick walls breathe out the day they have stored. Somewhere grain is being measured. Somewhere a hymn rises and fades. You drift now toward the largest structures in the city, and what's broadly accepted is that temples in Mesopotamia are not merely places of worship. They are storehouses, employers, landholders, archives, kitchens, and engines of social order. If the city is a body, the temple is one of the organs that keeps the whole creature alive when everything else goes wobbly. Most historians agree that temple institutions stand at the centre of early Mesopotamian life. Archaeology suggests that these complexes coordinate labour, collect offerings, store surplus, and anchor ritual routines that reinforce both divine and civic stability. The evidence we do have points to temples as places where continuity is made practical. Food is counted, land is managed, workers are assigned, ceremonies are performed, records are preserved. A more cautious explanation could be that when later people imagine arcs of survival, they are translating this real institutional role into a more dramatic, symbolic language. Not a boat of wood and pitch drifting on endless water, but a cool storage hall full of grain ledgers and people who know what must happen next. And frankly, that is a much more believable rescue plan than waiting for a miracle while standing ankle deep in floodwater with a goat and a very optimistic expression. You step beneath a gateway where carved details catch the lamplight. The air inside is different, cooler, dustier, tinged with incense oil, damp clay and grain. Workers move through the corridors with baskets and jars. An official murmurs to a scribe. A temple singer passes her voice, briefly brushing the air like a thread of smoke. Most historians agree that the temple in Mesopotamia is not separate from the economy in the modern sense. What's broadly accepted is that sacred and administrative life overlap deeply. One interpretation is that this overlap helps explain later legends of protected bloodlines. Families tied to temple service are tied at the same time to food security, social prestige, and stored memory. In a crisis, that combination can look very much like divine preservation. Historians still argue whether temple institutions in early city-states should be seen primarily as religious centres with economic functions or as economic centres clothed in religious meaning. The answer may shift by place and period, but either way, the temple is where survival becomes organised. It is where famine can be softened, where labour can be redirected, where rituals can calm a frightened population, and where the city can pretend with admirable confidence that somebody still has a plan. A careful reading might suggest that later stories about chosen lineages surviving catastrophe are really stories about households embedded in these temple systems, because the temple remembers. You pass a room lined with jars, sealed and marked. Grain rests in darkness like stored time. Nearby tablets wait on shelves, their little wedges holding deliveries, obligations, distributions, names. The evidence we do have points to temple archives and stores as major instruments of continuity. Most historians agree that when institutions preserve both resources and records, they become harder to erase than ordinary households. One interpretation is that bloodline legends later attach themselves to these institutional survivors, not because some glowing being singled them out from the heavens, but because they were anchored to the one structure everyone expected to endure. A fringe idea proposes that certain temple families were literally selected by the Anunnaki to carry sacred knowledge and biological continuity through each great catastrophe, hidden inside priestly offices that ordinary people only dimly understood. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. There is no broad mainstream basis for treating temple staff as a secret extraterrestrial preservation program. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it sharpens the emotional truth underneath. To the average labourer, the temple household might well seem half human and half something older. They know the rites. They keep the stores. They retain influence when rulers change. They speak with the authority of heaven while also holding the practical keys to tomorrow's bread. That combination has inspired stranger rumours than this. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe Ark is the wrong object, and the right one is an institution. A more cautious explanation could be that the temple functions as a survival vessel in social terms. It carries forward food, legitimacy, ritual order, and trained personnel. If flood war or political collapse strikes a city, may rebuild around whichever institutions remain coherent. The temple does not float above disaster exactly, it absorbs it, redistributes it, narrates it, and keeps the daily rhythm from dissolving entirely. The families woven into that process begin to look chosen because they are consistently at the hinge where loss turns into recovery. You can feel that hinge in the smallest details. A woman measures grain into bowls for workers. A scribe presses a seal into wet clay. A priest recites words that have been said before, and because they have been said before, reassure everyone listening that tomorrow still belongs to the same world. Most historians agree that repetition is one of the ancient tools of stability. Ceremony, inventory, and administration are not glamorous, but they keep panic from becoming policy. One interpretation is that later myths simply elevate this repetitive stability into sacred selection. The temple families did not just do their jobs. In memory, they became the ones who carried civilization through darkness. The layout of the complex itself adds to the feeling. Courtyards within courtyards, rooms within rooms, inner spaces growing quieter as you move inward. It is easy to see why the temple becomes, in imagination, a chambered refuge. Outside there is wind, mud, invasion, drought, rumour the usual ancient menu. Inside there is structure, measured time, stored food, hierarchy, hymn. Even the sound changes, softening against plaster and brick. You're not safe exactly because ancient life rarely offers that luxury, but you are held inside a system that knows how to persist. A popular rumour claims that whenever catastrophe struck, temple genealogies quietly determined who would be preserved, who would inherit, and who would carry the sanctioned line into the next age. This theory isn't widely accepted, though it brushes against something plausible. Temples do shape inheritance, prestige, and access. The solid ground is the institutions influence who keep status through crisis. The mist lies in imagining a single hidden list or an unbroken sacred program. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clue here is simple. When people look back at the past and search for chosen survivors, they often rediscover institutions before they rediscover individuals. By the time the last offerings are placed and the lamps burn steadier in the night, you understand why later storytellers would imagine the temple as an arc of continuity. Not because it sails above history, but because it keeps history from washing entirely away. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But as cool air gathers in the archive rooms and grain rests in its jars like a promise made to tomorrow, it becomes easy to picture certain temple-bound bloodlines surviving catastrophe, not on waves but in ledgers, storerooms, chants, and the quiet confidence of a building designed to outlast panic. The temple lamps dim behind you, and the city opens into quieter courtyards, where household life takes over from public ritual. You hear a baby fussing somewhere behind a reed screen, the scrape of a grinding stone, the low murmur of adults discussing grain, cousins, and obligations with the same weary seriousness modern people reserve for taxes and group chats. Now you move into the private machinery of continuity, and what's broadly accepted is that elite marriage in Mesopotamia protects property office alliances and social standing. Archaeology suggests that households are not just emotional units, if we may borrow a modern phrase with a straight face, but legal and economic structures through which status is preserved. If catastrophe tests the city marriage, often decides who still has a ladder once the waters go down. Most historians agree that family strategy matters enormously in ancient societies. The evidence we do have points to inheritance, dowry, kin, obligation, household labour, and alliance making as central features of Mesopotamian life. People do not marry only for romance, though I am sure somebody occasionally tries, and is immediately redirected by an aunt with practical concerns. A more cautious explanation could be that later stories of hidden survivor bloodlines grow from this very visible world of selective marriage. If elite families repeatedly marry within circles of office, ritual status and wealth, the result may look from a distance like a preserved line, intentionally kept intact across generations. And perhaps emotionally that is exactly how it feels. You step into a shaded courtyard where date palms lean over a mud brick wall and a basin catches the last of the evening light. A woman folds cloth beside a basket of reeds. An older man counts something under his breath with the stubborn concentration of a person who has been disappointed by other people's arithmetic for 40 years. Somewhere nearby, bread is baking, and the smell of it briefly convinces you that civilization is a splendid idea after all. Most historians agree that the household is the basic theatre where social order becomes durable. Property moves through it. Labour is organised through it. Ritual duties are maintained through it. Children learn their place in the world through it. One interpretation is that if catastrophe stories later speak of chosen bloodlines, they may be exaggerating the importance of exactly these household continuities. Historians still argue whether kinship in Mesopotamian records should be read mainly through legal formulas, or whether the emotional and practical texture of real family life was far more flexible than the documents suggest. That debate matters because documents preserve structure better than feeling. A marriage tablet can tell you who brought what into a union, who owed what, and perhaps what would happen if the arrangement failed. It does not tell you whether the bride liked the groom, whether the groom's mother was insufferable, or whether everyone secretly thought the match was a disaster waiting to happen. But what's broadly accepted is that these unions shape the distribution of power. So imagine crisis through that lens. A flood damages fields, a ruler falls, a temple changes leadership. Suddenly it matters very much which households are linked by marriage, whose daughters entered priestly lines, whose sons can claim rights through two families instead of one. A careful reading might suggest that bloodline myths later convert these practical alliance webs into the image of hidden selection. Not random marriage, but arranged preservation. Not social strategy, but sacred design. The shift is subtle and very human. A fringe idea proposes that elite marriages in Sumer were quietly arranged to preserve 13 designated lines favoured by the Anunnaki, ensuring that each catastrophe left behind the same core genetic inheritance. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. There is no broad mainstream proof of an ancient supernatural breeding program, and that sentence alone should remind us all that the human imagination is nothing if not energetic. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it helps reveal why marriage feels so symbolically loaded in old stories. Marriage decides continuity. It binds houses together. It turns survival from an individual accident into a multi-generational plan. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the so-called chosen bloodline is simply the household that knows how to make itself difficult to erase. A more cautious explanation could be that elite families survive because they diversify their attachments. One branch enters temple service. One branch marries into administrative office. One branch manages land. One branch handles trade. When one pillar cracks, another still stands. The city may lose a palace faction, but the family remains through a daughter in the temple quarter, or a cousin with archives access, or an in-law whose fields lie on a higher ground. That is not magic. It is strategic resilience with very good sandals. You watch a marriage negotiation unfold in the polite, careful way ancient adults perfected long before modern people started calling it networking. Gifts are discussed. Terms are implied. Status is weighed. Nobody says the quiet part too loudly, which is that this union is not merely about two young people, but about grain rights obligations and future stability. Most historians agree that marriage among elites protects and redistributes property. The evidence we do have points to women's dowries, family contracts, and household agreements as key components in preserving order. One interpretation is that later survival legends overlook how much continuity actually travels through these domestic arrangements. And that is worth pausing over. Because the phrase bloodline tends to summon images of fathers, kings and sons marching in a neat row toward destiny, which is an excellent visual and a terrible oversimplification. Real continuity is messier. It moves through mothers, daughters, sisters, widows, household managers, and all the invisible labour that keeps a lineage from collapsing into a pile of unpaid obligations and confused nephews. Most historians agree that women in Mesopotamia hold roles that vary by class and period, but the evidence we do have points to their substantial importance in property transfer, household management craft labour, and family strategy. If a line survives, it often survives through the very people. Later heroic myths are most likely to push into the background. A popular rumour claims that ancient marriage feasts in elite Sumerian circles concealed oaths of preservation, with certain houses sworn to carry sacred ancestry through whatever the gods sent next. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it clings to a recognisable truth. Weddings are moments when communities publicly acknowledge the future. They are hopeful, anxious, performative, expensive, and full of symbolic language. If you are living in a world of repeated instability, it would not take much for memory to recast such events as more than domestic arrangements. They become insurance against oblivion. The night grows quieter. A lamp gutters in the courtyard. From another house comes the soft rhythm of someone singing a child to sleep. Civilization narrows here to its most durable scale, not palace, not temple, but household. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But as families braid themselves together through marriage status and practical hope, you can understand how later generations might imagine each wedding feast carrying a hush of future catastrophe, as though the real vows are not only to each other, but to survival itself. The night has grown deep enough that even the busiest courtyards have softened into murmurs. A reed door creaks, a lamp hisses. Somewhere from a rooftop or a temple terrace, a watcher studies the sky with the solemn expression of a person who would very much like the heavens to stop sending mixed messages. You move now into the language of divine favour, and what's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian kingship is wrapped tightly in religious meaning. Archaeology suggests that rulers present themselves as chosen, blessed, appointed or upheld by the gods, and this is not a decorative flourish. It is central to how authority is explained. If a city survives disaster and a dynasty remains standing, divine favour becomes one of the most convincing ways to make sense of the outcome. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian rulers do not separate religion from politics in any modern way. The evidence we do have points to kings who build temples, sponsor rituals, claim divine support, and frame military or civic success as evidence of heavenly approval. One interpretation is that this language of being chosen gradually encourages later stories about whole bloodlines being preserved through catastrophe. If kingship can descend from heaven, then perhaps, in the imagination of later generations, survival can too. The leap is not small, but it is not difficult either. Human beings are endlessly willing to widen a royal slogan into a cosmic mystery. Historians still argue whether these claims of divine favour reflected genuine belief, political theatre, or a blend so complete that the distinction barely makes sense to the people living it. That debate matters here, because if a ruler says the gods chose his house, he might mean it piously, strategically, ceremonially, or all at once. A more cautious explanation could be that chosen to survive begins as royal propaganda before it drifts into mythic memory, not a hidden biological program, not a secret celestial registry, but a public language repeated so often that it begins to feel ancient and natural. The king survives because the gods favour him. His sons inherit because the gods continue to favour the house. the city rebuilds because the divine order has not withdrawn. Once that logic settles in bloodline, mythology practically writes itself. You follow a stone path toward a shrine court where incense hangs heavy in the air. Bronze bowls glint near the doorway. White garments move through lamplight like small drifting moons. A singer's voice rises thin and haunting, then falls back into the hush. Most historians agree that divine favour is not an abstract idea in this world. It is read in signs, rites, omens, victories, harvests, and public restoration. What's broadly accepted is that temples, rulers, and households all participate in the same cosmic vocabulary. When things go well, the gods are pleased. When things collapse, the gods have turned away, or been offended, or perhaps are simply expressing themselves with a degree of drama that could have been handled more constructively. One interpretation is that later bloodline legends grow from this cosmic vocabulary rather than from hard evidence of hidden lineages. A house that rules through repeated crises may later be remembered not merely as fortunate, but as marked. A careful reading might suggest that the phrase chosen survivors is a poetic translation of older ideas about divine legitimacy. The family did not just remain. The family remained because heaven allowed it, endorsed it, or required it. That is not the same as proof. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it raises the possibility that bloodline myths preserve the emotional residue of political theology. A fringe idea proposes that Mesopotamian kings and priests preserved literal descent from beings later identified with the Anunnaki, and that catastrophe was used to prune humanity while favoured lines were guided safely forward. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. There is no broad mainstream basis for treating royal ideology as a coded genetic survival plan. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can see why it appeals. Ancient kingship already speaks in a language so elevated, so ritualized, so drenched in divine symbolism, that modern ears sometimes decide symbolism is not enough. We want the pageant to conceal a machinery. We want the incense to hide a blueprint. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe what later generations call selection is really the social afterglow of legitimacy. A more cautious explanation could be that divine favour is the story a surviving house tells about itself, and the story others repeat because it helps life feel ordered after chaos. People want catastrophe to mean something. They want recovery to be deserved. They want the survivor to be more than lucky. If a dynasty endures flood, famine, invasion, or succession crisis, it is emotionally satisfying to say the gods chose them. It is less satisfying, though probably more accurate, to say they managed resources, well-cultivated allies, controlled ritual access, and had a talent for being in the right room when the old regime inconveniently collapsed. And yet the old language has power. You can hear it in the formal recitations, in the inscriptions carved or impressed for public memory. The king restores a temple because the god commanded it. The ruler defeats enemies because the deity strengthened his arm. The city rises again because divine order has been renewed. Most historians agree that such texts are ideological, but ideology is not the same as emptiness. It shapes behaviour, expectation, and memory. One interpretation is that families attached to this sacred language inherit not only rank, but narrative protection. Their place in the social imagination becomes harder to dislodge because they have been named as participants in cosmic order. A popular rumour claims that in times of disaster, priests quietly identified which households still carried divine approval, preserving them, while lesser lines were allowed to fade. This theory isn't widely accepted, though it reflects a familiar ancient concern. Omens matter, ritual standing matters, public favour matters. The evidence we do have points to a world in which signs and legitimacy can affect real political choices. A house marked as cursed or impious may lose support. A house marked as favoured may gain it. The selection is social, theological and practical all at once. To the people inside it, it might well feel supernatural. The shrine court grows quieter. The incense thins. Somewhere beyond the wall, a donkey objects to existence in a voice like badly tuned bronze. You almost admire the commitment. In the hush that follows, you can feel the city's deeper habit of thought. Order is not random. Rule is not random. Survival is not random. Or at least people prefer to say so. That is one of civilization's oldest comforts. If the world must hurt us, we would at least like the hurt to follow a pattern. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But as divine favour settles over kingship language, like oil over water, you can understand how the idea of chosen bloodlines begins to sound less like modern fantasy and more like an ancient political perfume, smoky, persuasive, and difficult to wash out once it clings to the surviving house. By the hour before dawn, the city has entered that strange soft pause when even the dogs seem to reconsider their career choices. The air is cooler now. The canal is a ribbon of dark metal. Somewhere a lamp still burns in a scribal room, and somewhere else a watchman shifts his weight and stares into the distance as if expecting history itself to come walking out of the reeds. You move now toward the number that begins to haunt the story, and what's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian texts love lists, sequences, rankings, and carefully arranged groups. Names are ordered, offerings are counted, gods are paired, hierarchies are stated, and memory is often made easier by turning the world into a pattern. One interpretation is that the mysterious 13 does not begin as a literal census of Sumerian survivor families, but as a later symbolic frame placed over older habits of ordered thinking. Most historians agree that ancient Near Eastern cultures work through lists with almost devotional seriousness. The evidence we do have points to lexical tablets, king lists, offering, lists, Sumerian series, administrative tallies, and genealogical structures that organise knowledge into memorable forms. Archaeology suggests that this love of sequence is practical as well as intellectual. A world of stored grain, temple duties, land allotments, and ritual timing benefits from clear order. But order also has emotional power. It makes the universe feel countable. It reassures you that the chaos outside the wall can somehow be turned into rows, columns, and named places on a tablet. Civilization at heart is often just panic arranged neatly. That matters, because later myths almost always want a number. Not an untidy crowd. Not several-ish important families. Definitely not a vague collection of cousins with excellent survival instincts. A tidy, resonant number. 7, 12, 40, 13. A careful reading might suggest that 13 in this case is more likely a symbolic frame than an ancient Sumerian administrative category. This is suggestive, not conclusive. There is no broad mainstream evidence for a surviving Sumerian tablet that plainly lists 13 bloodlines chosen to endure every Anunnaki catastrophe. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But if we treat the number as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it tells you a great deal about how people like to retrofit mystery onto fragmentary memory. Historians still argue whether number symbolism in Mesopotamian and later interpretive traditions should be treated as deeply embedded cultural logic, or as something modern readers too eagerly project onto old material. That debate matters here because 13 feels meaningful precisely when evidence is sparse. The mind hates a vacuum. Give it scattered kings, flood traditions, priestly houses, elite marriages, and a cosmic rumour, and it will immediately begin arranging them into a select number with the confidence of a man alphabetizing his spice rack during a thunderstorm. It is a very human impulse. You stand now in a courtyard open to the sky. The stars are beginning to pale. A clay jar cools against the wall. A broom leans in the corner with the resigned dignity of an object that knows it will soon be asked to solve problems larger than itself. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religious and administrative life often depends on ordered groupings. What's broadly accepted is that symbolic and practical classification overlap. Gods occupy ranks. Cities inherit kingship in sequence. Offerings are itemized. People think through order because order is how a fragile society survives. One interpretation is that later bloodline mythology borrows this same habit. If continuity exists, it must be countable. If survivors are chosen, surely someone once knew how many. A fringe idea proposes that 13 was the hidden number of protected lines because it stood just outside the obvious sacred counts, a deliberately veiled quantity known only to priestly or royal insiders. This theory isn't widely accepted, and there is no firm mainstream evidence for that claim. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it captures the mood of secrecy that later readers often crave. Not merely survival, but numbered survival. Not merely endurance, but curated endurance. A private tally made in the dark while the rest of the city sleeps through its own vulnerability. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe 13 is not ancient data at all, but later storytelling instinct. A more cautious explanation could be that modern mythmakers take older themes of continuity and compress them into a number that feels selective without feeling impossibly small. One survivor is too narrow. 100 is too messy. 13 feels like a gathered shadow around a torch. Enough to imply structure, few enough to imply privilege. It is the kind of number you can whisper. The kind of number that sounds as though it came from a locked room and a serious face. Still, the emotional pull is real. You can almost picture it. 13 figures at the edge of a storm-dark courtyard. 13 seals laid out beside a lamp. 13 families counted after flood famine, dust invasion, and dynastic collapse. The image is cinematic because it performs what history rarely can. It turns diffuse continuity into a visible scene. Most historians agree that real survival in Mesopotamia is spread across institutions, households, and changing political arrangements. The evidence we do have points to many forms of endurance, not a single closed set. But one interpretation is that myth condenses complexity so the mind can hold it. The chosen few stand in for the many tangled networks that actually preserve civilization. A myth loves a threshold. 13 is especially useful because it sits a little awkwardly beside more familiar symbolic numbers. It feels close enough to ritual order to seem ancient and strange enough to feel forbidden. That is very good for storytelling. Less good for historians, who generally prefer inscriptions to vibes, though every field has its burdens. A popular rumour claims that the number survives in scattered clues across later esoteric traditions, each one pointing back to an original Sumerian preservation schema. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it tells you something honest about the modern imagination. We do not like open-ended mysteries. We want old fragments to secretly cooperate. Most historians agree that ancient societies do not always give us the neat patterns we long for. What's broadly accepted is that the historical Sumerians leave us many lists, many names, many institutions, many disasters, and many reasons to think continuity mattered intensely. One interpretation is that 13 bloodlines is a modern poetic frame laid gently over those older materials. That does not make it meaningless. It makes it revealing. It shows how the present responds to the past. We search for selection because we fear randomness. We search for lineage because we fear erasure. We search for a number because a number can be held in the hand like a bead, whereas uncertainty spills everywhere. The first birds begin. The sky grows silver behind the walls. Somewhere a worker coughs awake, and somewhere else the first oven of the morning is being coaxed into life. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist, but as dawn gathers over the city and the mysterious 13 begins to take shape, you can feel why later storytellers would let 13 shadows gather at the edge of the storm. Not because ancient evidence clearly demands it, but because the mind faced with scattered survivors and broken memory so dearly wants the roll call to come out even. Dawn comes slowly over the floodplain, as if the light itself is reluctant to commit. The city reappears in layers, first the tops of walls, then reed roofs, then the shimmer of canal water, brown and metallic under the early sky. Somewhere a pot lid clatters. Somewhere a donkey announces, once again, that dignity is not universal. You move now out beyond the safer language of single flood myths and into the long exhausting reality of repeated crisis. And what's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian cities face more than one kind of catastrophe. Archaeology suggests that drought, shifting river courses, salinized soil warfare, political collapse, and ecological strain all threaten urban life at different times. If later stories compress all this into one grand pattern of Anunnaki catastrophes, the historical ground beneath that pattern is still very real. Most historians agree that the ancient Mesopotamian world is environmentally fragile. The evidence we do have points to irrigation systems that are both brilliant and vulnerable. Water has to be managed carefully. Fields can become oversalted. Rivers can shift away from the cities that once depended on them. One interpretation is that later catastrophe myths take many generations of strain and condense them into a single dramatic narrative, because that is how memory often copes. It is easier to say a great destruction came than to explain 6 generations of declining yields, labour pressure, canal maintenance problems, and the deeply unglamorous horror of administrative overreach. No oracle has ever thundered, "Behold, your spreadsheets are becoming unsustainable," but perhaps one should have. You walk along a field edge where the earth is pale and crusted in places, and what's broadly accepted is that soil salinization becomes a serious issue in parts of southern Mesopotamia over time. Archaeology suggests that crop patterns shift and agricultural stress can reshape local economies. The solid ground here is not cinematic, it is quiet and stubborn. A field does not need to explode to become dangerous. It merely needs to stop rewarding the same labour. A more cautious explanation could be that many so-called catastrophes are not single apocalyptic moments, but slow failures that wear a society down until survival belongs to those families best able to adapt. And adaptation is not evenly distributed. Most historians agree that elite households, temple institutions, and experienced administrators often have better odds in prolonged crisis because they can redirect labour, manage stored goods, preserve records, and maintain political ties. One interpretation is that later bloodline legends remember this uneven resilience in a more dramatic key. Instead of saying certain families had social advantages during drought and war, the legend says they were chosen to survive. Instead of describing institutional continuity, it imagines sacred preservation. The emotional truth is the same. Not everyone gets through. Some names remain, while others fade into the hot wind. Historians still argue whether major Mesopotamian urban declines should be explained mainly by environmental stress, military conflict, internal political fragmentation, or changing economic networks. Usually the honest answer is some unruly combination of all four. That debate matters because real collapse is rarely tidy. One city may suffer from river change, another from invasion, another from failed coordination among local powers, and another from a perfect, miserable blend of everything at once. A careful reading might suggest that later catastrophe myths flatten these varied crises into a repeating template, because repeating templates are easier to remember than messy causation. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the phrase every catastrophe is not about one species of disaster at all, but about the recurring fact that cities keep having to re-earn their existence. A more cautious explanation could be that bloodline survival myths grow from long observation of which households remain visible across different kinds of trouble. Flood comes and some survive. Drought comes and some survive. War comes and some survive. A dynasty falls and somehow a branch of the same old elite family appears again, wearing fresh loyalties and a deeply impressive lack of embarrassment. Over time that pattern begins to look less like luck and more like design. You enter a market district waking to its own rhythm. Baskets are set out. Fish glisten on mats. A woman argues over barley with the focused fury of someone who has no intention of being cheated before breakfast. Most historians agree that daily life in Mesopotamian cities depends on constant logistical success. Food must arrive. Labour must be organised. Contracts must be upheld. The evidence we do have points to societies that are resilient, but never effortlessly so. One interpretation is that long-term survival belongs to families who can anchor themselves in more than one system at once. Land temple administration, marriage storage trade. If one fails, another may carry them. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki engineered repeated catastrophes as periodic resets, preserving only those 13 lines deemed useful for restoring order afterward. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin. There is no broad mainstream support for treating Mesopotamian crises as a deliberate extraterrestrial filtration process. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it dramatizes a real ancient anxiety. Why does disaster seem selective? Why do some houses emerge again and again, while others are swallowed so completely that not even their doorways are remembered? Human beings do not enjoy randomness, especially when randomness ruins the harvest. What's broadly accepted is that catastrophe often reveals existing inequalities rather than inventing them. The household with reserves lasts longer. The family with scribal access negotiates better. The temple-connected lineage receives protection sooner. The kin group with a marriage ties in two cities has somewhere to go. One interpretation is that the myth of chosen bloodlines is really a mythologized description of systemic advantage. That may sound less mystical, but in the ancient world, it would still feel uncanny. When the same families endure every season of loss, of course, people begin whispering, and the whisper grows stronger in dusty times. You move toward the edge of town where wind has begun to lift fine grit into the air. The light turns pale gold. The horizon blurs. Archaeology suggests that climate variability and landscape instability shape long-term settlement patterns in Mesopotamia. Cities rise, shift, shrink, recover, and sometimes disappear. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know these pressures are real. We know resilience varies. We know later tradition dramatizes survival. What we cannot fully confirm is whether stories of selected bloodlines preserve any direct ancient memory beyond the obvious fact that continuity was never evenly shared. A popular rumour claims that every age of dust and drought saw the same hidden houses quietly protected, while the rest of the population endured the full weight of collapse. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because it turns slow suffering into visible pattern. People prefer villains, guardians, and secret lists to the more ordinary cruelty of environmental stress mixed with political advantage. Yet if we keep the solid ground separate from the mist, something subtler appears. Repeated catastrophes do not need secret overseers to produce familiar survivors. Human systems, left to themselves, are entirely capable of preserving hierarchy very efficiently. The sun lifts higher. Market noise swells. Work resumes, because work always resumes, which may be civilization's most heroic and least celebrated habit. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But as drought, dust, war, and river change gather into one long memory of danger, you can understand how later minds might speak of recurring Anunnaki catastrophes, while picturing the same weary, prepared, well-connected families, surviving not one grand apocalypse, but a long succession of punishing ordinary endings. The morning grows brighter, but the sky still keeps a faint silver haze, as though it has not fully decided whether to reveal itself or keep a little mystery in reserve. You move now from the grounded troubles of drought, war, and river shift into the stranger afterlife of those troubles where old Mesopotamian names are lifted into modern speculation and given new cosmic costumes. What's broadly accepted is that the Anunnaki belong to ancient Mesopotamian religious tradition as a group of deities associated in different texts with divine assembly, the underworld authority and cosmic order. A fringe idea proposes that modern writers later recast them as watcher-like beings who protected certain bloodlines through catastrophe. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it clings to the old names with remarkable confidence. Most historians agree that the Anunnaki, as they appear in ancient sources, are gods within a Mesopotamian religious world, not extraterrestrial overseers in the modern science fiction sense. The evidence we do have points to changing roles across texts, periods and languages. They are not always described in one fixed way. Sometimes the divine order shifts depending on time, place and literary purpose. A more cautious explanation could be that the modern image of the Anunnaki as secret managers of human survival says far more about recent fascination with hidden knowledge than it does about ancient Sumerian belief. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it is a useful one because it keeps us from letting the mist swallow the whole city. You pause beside a temple stair where the stone is warm already, and the city hums behind you with the ordinary racket of buying, baking, hauling, and trying not to lose track of 3 separate obligations before midday. Most historians agree that ancient religion is not built to satisfy modern conspiracy habits, though it accidentally feeds them rather well. Divine beings in Mesopotamian texts are powerful, unpredictable, and entangled with kingship ritual and cosmic balance. One interpretation is that later readers encountering these old names without enough context begin filling the silence with modern anxieties. The gods become ancient engineers, ritual becomes coded instruction, lineage becomes selective preservation. A careful reading might suggest that the fantasy of watchers above the city is really a fantasy of explanation. Someone somewhere must have been in control. Historians still argue whether the popularity of modern Anunnaki theories comes mainly from mistranslation, selective reading, distrust of mainstream scholarship, or the sheer emotional appeal of hidden design. The honest answer may be all of the above, with a dash of internet confidence and a complete lack of editorial supervision. But what's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamian texts do not straightforwardly describe a program of chosen human bloodlines being rescued through every catastrophe. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here the evidence is very thin indeed. Still, the theory survives because it offers something history rarely does. It offers a watcher. A fringe idea proposes that when great disruptions struck the earth, beings later identified with the Anunnaki quietly safeguarded a select few lineages, preserving them across the ages, so civilization could be restarted from familiar stock. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the mainstream evidence does not support it. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the image has a strange pull. High above the floodplain, While dust storms turn the horizon white and canals split from their banks, hidden overseers mark a few houses for continuity. It is pure cinema. You can see the courtyard, shadows, the sealed jars, the families who do not know why they keep surviving. The problem is not that the image lacks power. The problem is that power is not proof. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the modern watcher is a replacement for the ancient institution. A more cautious explanation could be that people uncomfortable with the plain human mechanics of hierarchy prefer to imagine an external selector. Temple connections, marriage strategy, resource control, scribal training, political flexibility, all of that is too mundane for a cosmic mystery, even though it is exactly how real continuity tends to work. So the mind raises its eyes to the stars and says, "No, surely something greater chose them." But the evidence we do have points to something more grounded. Ancient elites preserve themselves through systems, not through visible science fiction interventions. And yet ancient people did look upward. They watched stars. They tracked celestial events. They interpreted omens. Most historians agree that astronomy and divination held meaningful places in Mesopotamian thought, though we should be careful not to blend careful sky observation with modern alien narratives, just because both involve looking up after dark. Archaeology suggests that celestial patterns mattered for ritual timing and royal concerns. One interpretation is that this skyward habit later made it easier for modern mythmakers to attach outer space meanings to old divine names. A god associated with heaven becomes in careless modern retelling a visitor from beyond it. That leap is understandable, but not well supported. You can almost feel the leap happening in real time. A tablet mentions divine assembly. A king claims favour from high gods. A flood tale preserves selective survival. A later writer gathers these fragments, sprinkles uncertainty like too much salt, and suddenly the whole Bronze Age starts sounding like a classified memo. It would be funny if it were not so persistent. Well, it is still a little funny. Human beings have never met a fragment they could not over-romanticize. Give us half a clay sign and a dramatic sky, and we will absolutely invent a hidden council by supper. But let me rephrase that more carefully. The appeal is not foolish so much as revealing. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. When evidence is incomplete, imagination rushes in to furnish the room. The ancient world, with its damaged tablets and grand divine language, offers many empty corners. Modern Anunnaki theories furnish them with secret watchers, preserved lines, cosmic resets, and meaningful catastrophe. Most historians agree that this furnishing is modern. One interpretation is that it persists because it restores intention to suffering. Disasters did not just happen, they were managed. Survivors were not just advantaged, they were selected. That story is emotionally satisfying. History is often not. You walk past a group of labourers unloading jars near a wall still marked by older repairs. The city remains gloriously, stubbornly practical. Bread plate must still be baked. Records must still be copied. Roofs must still be patched. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian civilization survives because people keep doing those things. Not because invisible overseers descend at the perfect moment with elegant rescue protocols. A more cautious explanation could be that old gods in modern imagination become masks worn by our desire for hidden order. The Anunnaki of recent myth are not the same as the divine figures of ancient tradition. They are later echoes reshaped to answer modern fears. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But as the old names rise into modern rumour and the stars linger pale above the city, you can understand why the Watcher idea refuses to die. It offers purpose pattern and a quiet hand above catastrophe. The evidence may not support it yet. The yearning behind it is ancient enough to feel right at home. among temples, tablets, and the uneasy hope that someone somewhere was counting the survivors. The city is fully awake now, but you are learning that wakefulness in Sumer does not mean noise alone. It means rhythm, hands measuring grain, feet crossing courtyards, voices trading instructions, prices, blessings, and complaints in roughly equal measure. Somewhere a child laughs, somewhere a loom begins its steady little heartbeat. You move now into the quieter half of continuity, the part old myths often leave in the shadows, and what's broadly accepted is that households in Mesopotamia survive not only through kings, priests and scribes, but through the labour memory and practical intelligence of women. Archaeology suggests that textile work, food preparation, household management, family strategy, inheritance and child rearing all shape whether a line continues at all. If there are survivor bloodlines in any meaningful sense, they do not endure by male titles alone. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian society is structured by class status and gender in ways that vary over time and place, so any simple statement risks flattening a very uneven world. Still, the evidence we do have points to women participating in property arrangements, dowry systems, business activity, in some contexts household production, and the management of everyday continuity. One interpretation is that later bloodline legends understate this role because grand stories prefer crowns to cradles. Yet the cradle, the grain jar, the spindle, the marriage arrangement, the memory of kin obligations, and the quiet supervision of household stores may matter just as much as any royal inscription. A more cautious explanation could be that the truest survivors are often those later myth forgets to name. You step into a shaded domestic court where strips of dyed wool hang to dry, and a woman sits beside a basket of fibres, her fingers moving with such practised calm that the work seems almost like breathing. A child leans against her knee. Another carries a small jar with the solemn importance only children and temple officials can truly master. The air smells of bread dust, warm clay, and the faint sharpness of oil. Most historians agree that textile production is a major feature of Mesopotamian economic life, and that women's labour is central in many settings. What's broadly accepted is that households are not passive backdrops to history. They are production sites, training grounds, storage systems, and emotional shelters all at once. That matters because catastrophe always arrives at the household first. A flood is not initially a matter of royal ideology. It is a matter of soaked bedding, spoiled grain, frightened children, missing tools, and someone trying to remember where the sealed jar was placed last season. Drought is not first a scholarly category. It is a thinner bowl, a delayed loaf, a harder decision about marriage, labour or debt. One interpretation is that if certain bloodlines endure across repeated crises, their endurance depends on household competence far more than later elite mythology admits. A careful reading might suggest that continuity is maintained by the people who know how much barley is left, which cousin can be called upon, which daughter has marriage prospects, which child must be taught the family craft, which old story needs repeating so the young know who they belong to when the city begins to wobble. Historians still argue whether legal and economic texts preserve enough of women's lived experience to let us reconstruct their full role with confidence. That debate matters because documents tend to preserve what institutions value most clearly, and institutions are not always generous about giving domestic labour the spotlight. But the evidence we do have points to women as crucial carriers of continuity. One interpretation is that the bloodline survives through maternal strategy just as much as paternal naming. That is not especially mysterious. It is simply true in the practical sense that children are raised inside systems of care instruction and household management before they are ever folded into public office. A fringe idea proposes that the real chosen lines were preserved through women whose ancestry was more important than their husbands' titles, and that later traditions deliberately obscured this because sacred descent was guarded in the domestic sphere. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin, so let us say so gently. There is no broad mainstream proof of a hidden matrilineal Anunnaki preservation program in Sumerian culture. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it points toward a useful correction. The old stories may be looking in the wrong direction when they stare only at kings. A more cautious explanation could be that continuity always depended on those who maintained the house, the children, the stores, the marriage links, and the practical wisdom that turns mere survival into future survival. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the chosen survivors are not chosen because they rule, but because they can reproduce continuity in the deepest sense, not simply bear children though that matters, but teach pattern, preserve custom, carry recipes, rituals, names, obligations, songs and small habits of order. Civilization is not just temples and decrees. Civilization is also knowing how thick the porridge should be when to trade cloth, how to calm a frightened child during storm season, how to hide a little reserve in hard times, and how to marry the next generation into stability. Most historians agree that these domestic realities are harder to monumentalize, but no less central to long-term endurance. You watch an older woman correct a younger one at the loom, not harshly, just with the unmistakable authority of someone who has seen enough seasons to know that technique matters and shortcuts are the first cousins of regret. The scene is small, almost invisible by the standards of epic storytelling. Yet archaeology suggests that textile production, household labour and intergenerational training are deeply woven into Mesopotamian urban life. One interpretation is that when later ages imagine a survivor lineage, they are witnessing only the outer shell of something held together in rooms like this. A popular rumour claims that among the supposed 13 chosen bloodlines, the true carriers were the women who passed sacred traits quietly through households while public records celebrated the men. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it endures because it speaks to a real historical imbalance. Public memory often favours formal power, while private continuity does the harder and less glamorous work of keeping families real. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumour becomes almost tender. It shifts the spotlight from throne rooms to courtyards, from proclamations to lullabies, from dynastic bragging to practical devotion. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know women's work is crucial. We know households are engines of continuity. We know old records often preserve only slices of a larger life. What we cannot fully confirm is how many unnamed women stand behind every lineage later imagined as chosen. Probably more than any royal inscription would comfortably admit. The light has turned warm and high now, and the courtyard walls hold bright bands of sun. The loom beats on, a jar is lifted, a child is hushed, bread is turned. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But as the city breathes through its households, and women carry memory in forms too ordinary for monuments, you can understand how the truest survivor lines may have endured, not in crowns or temple processions, but in cradles, grain jars, woven cloth, and the patient domestic intelligence that outlasts nearly every catastrophe history can throw at it. By late afternoon, the light has turned honey-coloured on the mud brick walls, and the city seems to glow from within as though every courtyard has swallowed a little sun and is trying not to brag about it. You keep moving because survival stories never stay still. They migrate. They get borrowed, translated, polished, inflated, and marched into new empires wearing older perfume. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian traditions do not end neatly with Sumer. Archaeology suggests that Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian cultures inherit reshape, preserve, and reinterpret older Mesopotamian religious and political ideas across centuries. If there is a legend of survivor bloodlines, one interpretation is that it would not remain frozen in one city or one language. It would travel, adapting itself the way every durable myth does. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian civilization is a long continuum of cultural borrowing as well as change. The evidence we do have points to later peoples copying old texts, preserving ancient literary compositions, restoring older temples, and treating the past as something prestigious enough to inherit even when political power changes hands. Akkadian rulers absorb Sumerian traditions. Babylonian scribes study older works. Assyrian kings revive and reinterpret earlier sacred and royal patterns. A more cautious explanation could be that what later ages preserve is not one secret bloodline program, but a deep habit of cultural continuity. Still, to people looking backward, continuity can easily look hereditary. If old knowledge survives every regime change, someone must be carrying it. And usually someone is. You pass now through a scribal space where clay tablets from different centuries seem to whisper to one another in silence. One is old, another copied later, another updated by hands that lived long after the original city that birthed the text has changed its name, ruler, or political mood. Most historians agree that copying traditions are one of the reasons ancient Mesopotamian literature survives at all. What's broadly accepted is that old compositions are not always preserved unchanged. They are adapted, excerpted, translated, recontextualized. One interpretation is that this process itself feeds later bloodline myths. If families, institutions, and schools transmit old prestige across empires, then later audiences may imagine them not as custodians of tradition, but as descendants of a protected line stretching back into the oldest mud. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian cultural continuity should be understood mainly as institutional inheritance, elite education, or political reinvention dressed in ancestral language. That debate matters here because the story of 13 chosen bloodlines becomes most tempting when you notice how stubbornly certain patterns refuse to die. Kings keep invoking divine approval. Priests keep guarding ritual order. Scribes keep copying the old names. Temples keep anchoring legitimacy. Households keep marrying into advantage. A careful reading might suggest that later empires do not preserve a literal bloodline map, so much as preserve the social architecture that makes bloodline talk feel plausible. You move through a rebuilt district, one layer of brick resting on another, and beyond it rise the ambitions of later powers. Akkad Babylon, Assyria, different courts, different accents, different kings with the same incurable appetite for being remembered magnificently. Most historians agree that these later empires inherit from Sumer even while reshaping it. The evidence we do have points to continuity in writing systems, religious ideas, legal habits, and literary memory. One interpretation is that the legend of selected survivors becomes stronger, not weaker, when cultures inherit old prestige. The farther removed a civilization is from its beginnings, the more tempting it becomes to imagine a few privileged lines carrying sacred origin forward. A fringe idea proposes that the original Sumerian survivor bloodlines quietly passed into later imperial houses, influencing Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian elites, while concealing their true ancestry beneath changing royal titles. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. There is no broad mainstream proof that later Mesopotamian dynasties consciously preserved a secret roster of Anunnaki-protected lines. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the appeal becomes obvious. It turns messy historical inheritance into a single elegant conspiracy of continuity. Every empire becomes a costume. Every dynasty becomes a branch. Every old temple becomes a checkpoint in a lineage relay. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the bloodline, in its most enduring form, is not genetic at all, or not only genetic. A more cautious explanation could be that what survives across empires is a class of continuity. Trained scribes, temple families, administrators, merchants, tied to long networks, ritual specialists and households, skilled at attaching themselves to whatever new centre of power emerges. In that sense, the preserved line is social and institutional before it is biological. The same kinds of families survive even when the actual names shift, to later memory that can easily feel like the same hidden lineage wearing different robes. And robes, to be fair, can change a lot. You can picture a Babylonian scholar leaning over an older Sumerian text with the affectionate seriousness of someone restoring a family recipe nobody has fully understood for 6 generations. He copies the signs, he comments, he preserves. Most historians agree that later Mesopotamians treat Sumerian tradition as ancient and authoritative. What's broadly accepted is that the past acquires prestige simply by surviving long enough to become venerable. One interpretation is that later bloodline myths are really myths about prestige inheritance. Not every family can claim closeness to the oldest sacred world, so some try. They trace themselves backward. They emphasize continuity. They suggest that whatever catastrophe has swept away lesser houses, theirs remains attached to something older than empire. A popular rumour claims that even when cities changed languages and rulers, the chosen lines kept identifying one another through seals' ritual formulas and marriage alliances preserving an invisible map beneath official history. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it brushes against a truth history often teaches. Elite continuity is often less visible than official proclamations. Alliances travel quietly, schools preserve habits, temples keep memories under new rulers. If we treat the rumour as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a poetic way of describing how old patterns persist in fresh political weather. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know later empires inherit older traditions. We know scribes preserve ancient texts. We know legitimacy often depends on linking oneself to deep antiquity. What we cannot confirm is whether any literal chain of 13 chosen bloodlines travels intact from Sumer into later Mesopotamian history. Most historians agree that the evidence for such precision is lacking, but one interpretation is that later continuity itself becomes the raw material for the myth. When the same sacred language, ritual, authority, and elite structures keep resurfacing, imagination begins connecting them with an invisible thread. By now, the light has softened, and the city seems older than any single ruler could ever claim. Clay tablets dry, temple shadows lengthen, children cross courtyards where older empires once stood beneath the same warm sky. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But as Sumerian memory drifts forward into Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian worlds, you can understand how each later empire might seem to carry an older family whisper inside it, faint as perfume, in old wool, stubborn enough to survive every catastrophe by becoming tradition itself. By evening, the heat finally begins to loosen from the walls, and the city exhales like an old animal settling into itself. The market noise fades, courtyards quiet down. A few lamps appear in upper rooms, small amber stars beneath the first real stars above. You have come a long way through mud, tablets, flood memory, temple grain, marriage strategy, royal theatre, and modern rumour. And now you arrive at the gentlest but hardest place in the whole journey. Not the question of what survives, but the question of what survival means when the evidence is partial and the imagination is restless. What's broadly accepted is that archaeology gives us cities, burials, tablets, seals, institutions, and patterns of continuity. One interpretation is that the legend of 13 chosen bloodlines grows in the open space between those patterns and our desire for a hidden design. And what if the story is pointing at something else entirely, something less like a secret and more like a longing? Most historians agree that the ancient Mesopotamian past is both rich and frustrating. The evidence we do have points to extraordinary complexity but not to perfect clarity. Cities rise and fall, dynasties claim divine support, scribes preserve names unevenly, temples anchor social order, households carry memory in ways official texts only partly reveal. Archaeology suggests a civilization deeply concerned with continuity in a dangerous world. That is solid ground. The miss begins when later readers ask whether continuity itself conceals a deeper intention, whether the surviving names are more than the visible tops of institutions, whether the old lists and flood traditions are whispering about selected lines beneath the surface. Historians still argue whether later theories about ancient bloodlines reveal genuine echoes of old memory or mainly modern hunger for pattern. That debate matters more than it first appears, because a theory can be wrong in its details and still reveal something true about human beings. A fringe idea proposes that 13 bloodlines were chosen to endure every Anunnaki catastrophe on Earth. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin, so we should say so plainly. There is no broad mainstream basis for treating surviving Mesopotamian records as proof of a literal preserved roster, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the idea becomes useful in another way. It shows you what modern minds reach for when confronted with ancient fragments. Not randomness, not silence, selection. You walk now beside a wall where old repairs can still be seen beneath newer plaster, and it becomes difficult not to feel the metaphor pressing rather hard. Civilization patches itself. Memory patches itself. Stories patch themselves. Most historians agree that surviving evidence is never the whole of the past. What's broadly accepted is that preservation is selective. Some materials endure, others rot, wash away, burn, or were never written down at all. A careful reading might suggest that bloodline myths emerge precisely because the surviving record is patchy. When enough names remain to suggest continuity, but not enough to explain it, fully imagination steps in and supplies a hidden thread. And hidden threads are very flattering things to invent. They make history feel intentional. They rescue us from the awkward truth that sometimes the same families endure because institutions favour them, because archives remember them, because resources gather around them, because marriage strategies work, and because whole societies can be astonishingly efficient at preserving hierarchy while pretending destiny did it. A more cautious explanation could be that the mystery of chosen survivors is often the mystery of documented advantage. That may sound less enchanting, but it has its own dark elegance. The house survives because it is near the temple, near the archive, near the grain, near the new ruler, near the right marriage, near the right story. Close enough to continuity for continuity to keep touching it. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the real divide is not between truth and myth, but between visible continuity and invisible continuity. Kings appear in lists, priests appear in offices, scribes appear in archives, but beneath those visible traces are all the quieter lines, the women who hold households together, the labourers who rebuild walls, the apprentices who copy tablets, the families who disappear from prestige but remain in place through skill and adaptation. One interpretation is that the myth of 13 chosen bloodlines narrows the field too much. It focuses the lantern on a select few and leaves the edges dark. Yet the edges are where much of real survival lives. Most historians agree that the past does not owe us a perfect explanation. Archaeology suggests continuity, yes, but also rupture, improvisation and loss. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And here the mist is beautiful precisely because it does not quite resolve. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. That sentence belongs here more than anywhere else. We know enough to say that Mesopotamian societies prized continuity, encoded legitimacy through lineage, endured repeated catastrophe, and preserved certain households more visibly than others. We do not know enough to say that 13 literal bloodlines were selected by divine beings and shepherded intact through every age. A popular rumour claims that once you have seen the pattern, you cannot unsee it. The same surviving houses, the same priestly circles, the same old prestige resurfacing under new names. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because old continuity really can feel eerie when viewed through enough centuries. You begin with mud brick city-states and end with layered empires still speaking through older forms. You begin with flood memory and end with ritual order still intact. You begin with a few surviving names and end with a whole mythology of preservation. That drift from evidence to aura is one of the oldest transformations in human thought. You pause at the edge of a temple terrace and look out over the city as the darkness deepens. The canal catches the last light. Smoke rises thin and blue from evening fires. Somewhere a hymn begins again, quiet, this time almost private. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion and politics are built to locate meaning in survival. What's broadly accepted is that divine favour, legitimacy, and endurance are closely linked. One interpretation is that later bloodline theories are not absurd intrusions into the old world, but exaggerated descendants of its own habits of thought. The ancient city already believed continuity meant something. Modern myth only turns up the volume. And perhaps that is why the theory lingers. Not because it is fully evidenced. Not because it is beyond dispute. Quite the opposite. It lingers because it stands exactly where evidence runs thin and yearning grows strong. It offers shape to uncertainty. It gives selective survival a cast of chosen names. It makes catastrophe feel organised rather than blind. It says that beneath history's patchy surface there may be a design, even if we cannot prove it. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And some clues lead to tablets, while others lead to the mirror of your own need for pattern. By the time the first true night breeze crosses the terrace, you can feel the question settling into its proper form. Not did 13 chosen bloodlines certainly survive every Anunnaki catastrophe on Earth that is too blunt, too hungry, too sure of itself. A better question is this: why do human beings return again and again to stories in which a few are preserved when the many are lost? Most historians agree that the answer lies somewhere between fear-memory hierarchy and hope. The ancient Mesopotamian world gives us all four in abundance. So you stand there in the darkening air above the city that keeps remembering and forgetting itself, and let the puzzle remain a puzzle. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But as the lamps gather below and the old names hover just beyond certainty, you can understand why scholars continue to debate, why dreamers keep searching, and why the story feels less like a solved secret than an invitation to sit still, with all the ways survival can be real, selective, meaningful, and never fully explained. Night has settled fully now, and the city below you has become a constellation of small human lights, oil lamps in courtyards, temple flames in their niches cooking fires, dwindling into ember-red whispers. The wind has softened. The canal no longer flashes but merely breathes, a dark ribbon moving through the sleeping plain. You have walked a long way through this world tonight, through clay and kingship and flood, memory and temple grain and marriage bargains and copied names. And now you come to the place where the solid earth and the drifting mist must sit beside each other, without trying to swallow one another whole. What's broadly accepted is that Sumer left records of power, ritual, survival, and adaptation in a dangerous landscape. One interpretation is that the idea of 13 chosen bloodlines is a later poetic framework laid over ancient fragments. And what if that framework matters not because it is fully literal, but because it captures the old feeling that survival itself is never evenly shared? Most historians agree that Mesopotamian civilization emerges in a world of repeated risk. The evidence we do have points to flood, danger, unstable rivers, ecological strain, war, political change, and the constant need to rebuild. Archaeology suggests that city life in southern Mesopotamia depends on institutions strong enough to outlast disruption: temples, archives, households, labour systems, ritual authority, and the learned habits of people who know how to stitch order back together after damage. That is the solid ground. A more cautious explanation could be that when later minds imagine a hidden roster of chosen survivors, they are dramatising this visible pattern of uneven endurance. Certain houses remain near power. Certain functions remain indispensable. Certain names stay lit in the archive, while most others sink into the dark. Historians still argue whether stories of special bloodlines preserve any direct, ancient memory, or mainly reflect later symbolic thinking layered onto partial evidence. That debate belongs here at the end because it keeps the whole journey honest. There is no full consensus, and we should not pretend otherwise. A fringe idea proposes that 13 Sumerian bloodlines were selected by the Anunnaki to survive every catastrophe on Earth, carrying sacred continuity through flood, drought, dynastic collapse, and imperial change. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The mainstream record does not plainly hand us such a list. It does not confirm a hidden preservation program. It does not prove that ancient divine names should be read as literal overseers of human lineage. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, something gentler emerges. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the 13 bloodlines are not a secret biological vault, but a mythic way of describing continuity under pressure. A careful reading might suggest that ancient people and modern readers alike are trying to answer the same uneasy question. When the world breaks, why do some lines, households, and institutions remain? Most historians agree that the practical answers involve grain, marriage archives, ritual legitimacy, labour, geography, and social advantage. One interpretation is that myth translates those practical answers into sacred language, because sacred language feels worthy of survival. It lets catastrophe become a test rather than a mess. It lets continuity sound chosen rather than merely inherited. It lets the few who remain seem luminous against the long, anonymous dark. You can feel the temptation of that luminous story. Picture it once more, not as proof, but as calm imagination. 13 houses, 13 lines, 13 clusters of memory surviving each turn of ruin. One near the temple storerooms, one in the scribal quarter, one bound by marriage into priesthood, one carrying old ritual songs, one preserving seals and land claims, one holding the domestic intelligence of grain, cloth, kin, and children, one drifting from Sumer into Akkad, then Babylon, then Assyria under changed names, but familiar habits. It is a beautiful image, too beautiful perhaps to be trusted literally. Yet beauty often attaches itself to questions that never fully close. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamia teaches continuity through institutions, not through fantasies alone. The evidence we do have points to survival as layered work. Someone must count, someone must store, someone must teach, someone must lead, someone must rebuild the wall, someone must sing the rite correctly so the city feels like itself again. One interpretation is that the bloodline legend survives because it compresses all those functions into a single symbol. Instead of saying civilization endures through many overlapping human systems, the legend says a chosen few carried the thread. That is not the whole truth, but it may be a poetic truth about how endurance looks from far away. A popular rumour claims that the chosen lines still echo through later history, that the old pattern never ended, that somewhere, even now, the same quiet continuity is at work beneath the noise of public life. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers because the old longing lingers. We want survival to mean something. We want memory to have a keeper. We want the broken places in history to hide a thread rather than a tear. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And in that uncertainty, the story remains alive, not as a solved code, but as a human habit of thought stretching across millennia. So where do you finally place your feet? On the solid ground first. Sumer was real. Its cities were real. Its risks were real. Its institutions mattered. Its elite households and ritual systems did help determine who remained visible through disaster. Its traditions did travel into later civilizations. That much is broadly accepted. Then beside that ground, you allow the mist its place. It's possible that later bloodline legends preserve emotional memory of selective survival. It's possible that symbolic numbers like 13 are later frames imposed on older fragments. It's possible that stories of Anunnaki protection tell us less about ancient gods and more about the perennial human need to imagine pattern behind catastrophe. And now with the city quiet below and the stars steady above you, let the pace ease. The lamps seem farther apart now. The canal sounds softer, less like water moving, and more like breath in the dark. The walls that held heat all day finally give it back to the night in long, patient sighs. A child has stopped crying somewhere. A dog has given up arguing with the moon. The temple hymn you heard earlier has faded into a memory of sound, and even memory begins to loosen around the edges. You do not need the final answer anymore. You only need the calm shape of the question. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we've said so. We've kept the solid ground separate from the mist, and now the mist can drift without needing to become anything harder. You can picture the old city sleeping, reed roofs silvered by starlight, courtyards cooling, grain jars resting in stillness, clay tablets drying on shelves, holding names that outlived the hands that pressed them. Somewhere perhaps the old idea remains that a few lines carried something forward when the world became uncertain. Maybe that means blood, maybe it means memory, maybe it means ritual skill patience, or the simple stubborn refusal to let order vanish completely. Whatever the answer the night is, kind enough not to demand it from you. So let the last lights grow smaller. Let the names recede into the dark water and the warm clay and the soft fan hum in your room. Let the ancient city sink gently into distance, not lost, just quiet. And let yourself drift with it, past the temples, past the riverbanks, past the old arguments, between evidence and wonder, into that softer place where history becomes atmosphere and atmosphere becomes sleep.